Hello, everybody. This is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class, and I am here with you um, doing another kind of tutorial for this unit, a little overview of the unit to give you some information and hopefully make it easier for you to understand. So we are in Unit 4 still. We are all the way to Lesson 12, though, Complex Ecosystem Transformations. So our key terms here are biodiversity, biome, community, ecosystem, population, tundra biome. So those are our key terms for the first part of this lesson. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, there is also a lesson guide that goes along with this. This is found underneath my picture on our website. There's a link, and you should be able to access this as well. Kind of gives you the key ideas for this lesson. So first we're talking a little bit about how like one thing within an ecosystem can have kind of a cascading effect and affect other parts of that ecosystem. And we'll talk about multiple examples of that. So these are complex ecosystem transformations. So this picture here is showing really just kind of a smoggy city. And one of the things that can result as from this type of pollution is eventually this pollution can settle out of the air in clouds, fall along with rain, with precipitation to the ground in the form of acid rain. Sometimes we actually call this acid precipitation because sometimes it's not actually rain, sometimes it's snow or sleet or whatever, but it has a more elevated acid content, a lower pH. So it lowers the pH of whatever surface it lands on. And so living things, they're pretty sensitive. Living things generally, this is kind of a general term, but for the most part, they prefer pHs that are close to neutral. Neutral pH is 7. So living things are going to prefer kind of a pH closer to that 7. Acid rain has a pH that is in the upper 6s, mid 6s, sometimes even as low as 6 on the pH scale, which doesn't seem like super acidic, but it is quite acidic. Remember, you might not know this, but the pH scale is what is known as a logarithmic scale. So that means that a pH of 6 on the pH scale is actually 10 times more acidic than a pH of 7 on the pH scale. So we're talking about 10 times more acidic. For certain living things, this can be a problem and can really affect those living things and different parts of the ecosystem that kind of depend upon those living things, right? So it talks a little bit about how one biome, remember, biome is more of a larger area, right? So we have our ecosystems, which are made up of all the different populations of living things, so all the communities and their abiotic factors as well, right? That's an ecosystem. Well, a biome is a larger kind of system. There are multiple biomes that all have about the same climate, around the same temperature and precipitation levels. And one type of a biome is known as the tundra. And the tundra, when we click on that, it tells us this is a cold, treeless biome in the Arctic with frozen soil, permafrost covered by lichens and mosses. And that is our definition of biome. And it says here that when acid rain or acid precipitation falls in the biome, it turns snow a darker color. So there's a chemical reaction here that actually changes the color of snow. So what? The snow's a little bit darker. Who cares? Well, it turns out this actually has kind of a cascading effect, like we said earlier. Snow has a very high albedo. Albedo is how much light that surface can reflect. Obviously, you guys have probably had this experience in Wisconsin before. You go outside, it's a very bright and sunny day, and you kind of get blinded by the snow. In fact, snow blindness is actually a thing. People can literally suffer eye damage if they spend too much time in very bright light under a large snow cover. So, what happens is that albedo from the snow reflects light from the sun, and it reflects that light back out to space. So sunlight comes down, it's reflected off the white of the snow, it is going space bound, and it kind of keeps that area cooler. If that snow had not been there, then the light would be absorbed by the ground. And then once light is absorbed, it is re-radiated from the ground and it makes that area actually much, much warmer. So it actually has an effect of changing the climate, the local climate in that specific area. So this causes the temperature of the snow to increase, it causes the snow to melt, and as you can imagine, it has a lot of effects on the different organisms that live there. A lot of Arctic animals are adapted to living in that snow cover. So their coloration, their habitats, and things like that are dependent upon a large amount of snow cover. For example, it says seals will have trouble coming out of the water. Polar bears will need to spend more time and energy hunting for food. Camouflage is like lost for Arctic hares and baby seals and things like that. And so that has a bigger effect on that whole ecosystem. We move a little bit further to the south, we end up in the boreal forest, which is also known as the taiga. And in this area, which is just like, again, south of the tundra, we see that a predominant life, we have very keystone populations of these mosses and lichens. And lichens are literally like they're like a combination of a fungus that is living with um, an algae. So we have kind of an algae or a fungus that live in a symbiotic relationship with each other. It's mutualistic relationship, right? And we say that these lichens are what are known as indicator species. And that's really kind of an important term. An indicator species is very sensitive to change. And so scientists use certain indicators here. This is a lichen. Sometimes there are other types of indicators for water quality and air quality in other areas. They use these indicators to indicate to them whether or not there's a problem. Generally, those indicators are more sensitive, so we see changes in them first before we would see them in more resilient types of organisms. Some organisms are just a little bit more tolerant of change than others, and so we don't see the change. We don't see them affected as quickly as the indicators. Generally, the indicators are like, this is if there's a problem, and if it's not remedied, that problem starts to affect other organisms in that ecosystem as well. But the indicators are like the first affected. So it's a good time to act when we start seeing effects on indicators. So these lichens, they start to die off. Well, they provide food for a lot of organisms. There's not a lot of plants that are growing way, way up near the Arctic Circle. It's pretty cold. There's a lot of periods of just complete darkness in that area. So lichens provide a lot of food. In fact, they provide food for the entire reindeer population. Oh man, Santa would be really, really disappointed if all of the lichen was destroyed because the reindeer would starve to death. That would be completely sad to billions of children all around the world. So we don't want that to happen, right? Lichens are slow growing. The decline in the population of lichen, it says here, takes many, many years to correct because if you kill them off, it takes many years for them to regrow. And they really could be a permanent change depending on whether or not, the climate change itself is permanent. So that's kind of the first part of this. Um, Actually, take that back. There's one more section here talking about climate change because we kind of started talking a little bit about climate change as well. We were talking about acid rain, which is one effect, one cause that can have an effect that's cascading. Climate change can do the same thing, right? So, what is climate change? You've probably heard the term climate change. You've heard the term global warming. You wonder why there's two different terms altogether. And the fact of the matter is that climate change can cause global warming. Global warming is like it sounds. The Earth's average temperature is getting warmer. Climate change is encompassing not just the fact that it's getting warmer, but all the other things that result from the global warming that's happening. That makes sense. So if the Earth's temperature on average goes up, there's many different climate effects that occur. Some areas will have increased drought, some areas will have increased precipitation. And so remember that climate is average temperature precipitation. So we're seeing kind of changes in climate globally that are being caused by changes in average temperature on Earth. So, what are some of these changes? Let's see here. So, talking a little bit about migration and how migration can be affected. For one, if it starts getting warmer at northern climates, right, then you're going to see organisms that don't normally flourish there pushing their way further to the north or to the south. We're northern hemisphere people, so we tend to get a little bias when it comes to that. But you start seeing that maybe certain plant species that don't normally survive at like higher latitudes can now survive at those higher latitudes closer to the pole, and they start pushing out the native species. So they're kind of encroaching. They would be considered non-native at that point, and generally in the past they wouldn't have made it because the temperature would have been too low for them. But because the temperatures are going up, they're now able to survive where they weren't before. And of course, non-native species oftentimes don't have predators in certain areas, and so they tend to do sometimes a little bit better. If they become invasive, it's because they do better in that situation. We also have effects on migration. Some birds, for example, that normally would migrate to the south during cold climate may not migrate when temperatures don't drop like they should, right? And that puts a lot of pressure on that ecosystem because now we've got birds that are living where they shouldn't be living, and there may not be food sources for those birds. And so it might lead to some reduction in certain species that haven't kind of really don't know what to do when the temperature does not drop like it should. And now we're moving on to the end part of this lesson, and it talks a bit about other effects of climate change in a different biome. I'm talking a bit about the ocean biome here, the coral reef biome, for to be specific. The coral reefs can be affected by changes in climate as well. Specifically, it refers to kind of two major effects. One is ocean acidification, and one is coral bleaching. And we have kind of talked a little bit about coral bleaching before as well. So, again, ocean acidification. Remember, you've got that pH scale. It goes from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral, 0 is most acidic, and 14 is most basic. When carbon dioxide, which is a gas, dissolves with water, dissolves in water, it creates something called carbonic acid. If you ever drink a soda, it's basically carbonic acid that's been flavored because you are essentially dissolving carbon dioxide into water to make something fizzy, right? And so then it is refreshing and delicious, but it's also acidic, which is some people talk about how that affects your teeth and stuff like that. Well, the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolves in the ocean as well, and it creates carbonic acid in the ocean. And it's not nearly as carbonated as your bottle of soda, but it does lower the pH of the ocean water. The more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the higher the amount of carbon dioxide gets dissolved in the water, so the lower the pH gets, right? It gets more acidic. And so that has an effect on ocean organisms that don't necessarily like higher levels of acid in their water. And again, we're not talking about you stick your hand in and it dissolves your flesh kind of acid. This is just like a small change, but living things are sensitive to small changes. Another small change that can happen is due to changes in temperature, right? If the surface or the temperature of the ocean, sea surface temperature changes just a few degrees, that puts stress on ocean organisms that really, really rely upon a stable environment. One such is we have these algae that live inside the tissues of corals. They're called zooxanthellae. I think we've talked about these guys before, at least I think we have. They live in a symbiotic relationship with the coral, and they're very, very sensitive. And when sea surface temperature changes, if it gets too warm, the zooxanthellae don't like it. They will actually leave, they'll completely extricate themselves from the coral, and they'll leave, leaving the coral completely without any zooxanthellae algae in their tissues. When that happens, the coral turn a bright white color because the color of the coral that we see is completely due to the presence of their symbiotic, um, they're symbiotes. I don't know, like whatever you call it, but they're the algae that live within their tissue. They're the hosts, and I guess those are the symbionts or whatever. So when the algae exit, the color goes away and they are white, and that's why it's called coral bleaching. Yeah, the coral don't die immediately from that. They can sustain themselves for a little bit, but they do depend upon the zooxanthellae for a large part of their food. So if they're gone, they do die. And coral reefs are huge, like ecosystems. They're the most diverse ecosystem in the oceans, and in fact, one of like arguably top one or two most diverse ecosystem in the world. So thinking about all the different organisms that are dependent upon the coral to stay alive, and not just that, ladies and gents, but like fisheries in general. There's a lot of fish that use coral reefs as nurseries to for baby fish, right? And so those fish will leave to go out in the open ocean when they're big enough, but a lot of the fisheries would collapse with the collapse of the coral reefs as well. So that's just a couple of different examples. You have one thing that happens, um, big or small, and it has a cascading effect in multiple trophic levels and ultimately can lead to collapses of entire ecosystems. All right, so that's pretty much, ladies and gentlemen, the gist of this lesson. Hopefully you learned something or reinforced something you already knew. I will see you guys in my next recording. Have a great day.